So first, I'd like to explain why I'm here. Thank you very much, Emmanuel, having associated me to this project. I'm very much involved with Jean Monnet projects. I'm a Jean Monnet professor, and we also have now a Center of Excellence, and I am also leading several EU Jean Monnet projects, where I deal also with the question of European crisis, and one of these crises, of course, the migration crisis. So this is why I'm here. I'm the representative of Europe, but not really Europe, because we have a person who's not here today, who is Can, who's representing Turkey. Turkey is part of Europe, so I'm more the EU representative in the network. Of course, this is is a challenge because the EU is composed of so many countries, and these countries have different policies. And I would like to maybe explain what the migration crisis in Europe was all about and what's at stake with this migration crisis. Now, the underlying principles in the EU with regard to the migration policies are two treaties in the European Union, and these treaties are at stake when we talk about the migration crisis. The first treaty is the Schengen Convention, which has been put in place in 1990 already, but not by all EU member states. And it was put in place in link with the project of the single European market and the fact that you have free mobility and no borders inside, and that you need to put into place something to protect, to make sure that if you have an inflow of migrants, that they are dealt with somehow. So this was linked to the process of European economic integration. It has been put into the European treaties in 1997 only. So it then concerned all EU member states, but we have some opting outs. For example, the UK has been opting out since the start on this Schengen Convention. The second convention was the Dublin Convention, which was also adopted in its first version in 1990, which is taking care of the external borders. So when a migrant comes in, then the main principle was that the country where the migrant arrives is responsible for treating and dealing with the asylum application. And in relation with this Dublin Convention, we have then, and Emmanuel has talked about this, the tool of Frontex, which is there to survey or control the external borders. Schengen also has a certain number of annexed tools to ensure security inside the European Union, which is, for example, Europol, Eurojust, and the Schengen information systems. There's a problem at the beginning with these tools, is that they are from the start not sufficiently integrated. It's not a community policy, which is, in charge by the European Commission. It's not a community policy. And it puts the burden of the management of migrant flows on the external states, for example, Italy and Greece, and they have been left on their own with the management of these migrant issues. So when I come to the second point of my intervention, the migration crisis and the consequences for the EU policies, I have to say the crisis has not arisen in 2015. It was at its peak in 2015, but it was something that developed slowly and surely at the shores of Italy, at the shores of Greece, where the migrants arrived, and the Italian state or the Greek state had to try and cope with this, and were really left alone by the rest of the EU countries, so that's not our business. And why did the peak arrive in 2015? It was the German decision of Angela Merkel to say, wir schaffen das, and to use the so-called sovereignty clause in order to say, well, we assume responsibility for the migrants, we let them come in following the Syrian crisis. And what's less known in the public is that it was not only Germany taking this decision. For example, the Czech Republic also did the same, which is quite surprising today because the Visegrad countries are seen as hostile to migrants today. But this is a development in time. At first, the Czech Republic had the same reaction as the German state. And this, of course, created the problems to the EU treaties. The Dublin Convention was suspended because it was no longer the external state who dealt with the migrants. And then there were three different responses to the migration crisis. There were so-called welcoming countries like Germany or Sweden who accepted the migrants into their states. They're what I call the status quo countries, France, Denmark, Austria, who had to try and deal with this, but they didn't really want to take in the migrants. And then there were the refusal countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, who did not wish to take in the migrants. And this also led to three different reactions. The welcoming policies of the pro-migrant countries at first, which they had to then change with the mass of migrants coming in. They had to review their generous national policies. The status quo countries sometimes put into place new borders, because they did not want to take in these migrants. And the refusal countries ended up building fences and walls. So what the migration crisis showed from the start was an incapacity of the EU to deal with the problem. But it's not a fault of the EU itself. It's a fault. The problem is that the migration issue is a nationally dealt with issue, and it's not an EU policy. And that was so each state could have a different policy and an opposed policy. And what has been one solution by the EU is to externalize the problem and have a deal with Turkey in order to keep the migrants outside of the European Union, but this is not a permanent solution. So the migration crisis has been accused, the EU, of showing the failure of European integration, but in fact it's a lack of European integration which is at stake because they have not put into place an EU policy. Now, in conclusion, we have the two treaties of the European Union, Dublin and Schengen, are at stake. Dublin, they are currently negotiating a fourth version of Dublin. The problem with Dublin is they can't agree to get quotas to dispatch the migrants. And as long as they can't agree on this, there won't be a solution for Dublin. As for Schengen, we thought Schengen would be, ended with the migration crisis. We found out it's not the case, because Schengen has a clause that allows for suspension and to reintroduction of border controls, but this is not supposed to be a permanent solution. And some states, and my state, France, has put in border controls as a permanent solution, and that is then a real question mark for the continuation of Schengen. And as for European integration, this is really my worry about the migration crisis, is that the EU is accused of, it puts a myth to the idea of a Europe without borders, which is what the EU integration has been all about. So those who oppose populist movements say, well, the EU doesn't work, you can see it, and we have to put back into place borders, and you can end the EU and the European integration process. But what they don't see is that it's not the fault of the European integration, but what you have to put into place is more community policies. That's what I would advocate for, and I'll stop here.